The sound of worn boots on wooden planks echoed through the empty street as Sarah knocked on yet another door. Her stomach had been empty for 2 days, her last coin spent on a cup of coffee that barely warmed her hands. When the door opened, to reveal a weathered cowboy with kind eyes, she prepared for another rejection. Instead, he spoke words that would change everything. "I have work for you, miss. The job is being my wife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The Wyoming Territory sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Cedar Falls, casting sharp shadows between the weathered buildings that lined the main thoroughfare. Sarah Mitchell clutched her worn carpetbag closer to her chest, feeling the meager contents shift with each step. 3 dresses, all mended multiple times, a small Bible her mother had given her, and exactly 17 cents that jingled mockingly in the small cloth purse tied to her wrist. She paused before the painted sign that read, "Cedar Falls General Store," and smoothed down her faded blue dress, trying to make herself presentable. The fabric had once been a vibrant cornflower blue, but months of wear and careful washing had left it pale and thin. Her dark brown hair, once her pride, hung limp beneath a bonnet that had seen better days. At 23, Sarah had the bearing of someone much older, worn down by circumstances beyond her control. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the storekeeper looked up from his ledger. He was a portly man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and his expression immediately shifted from mild curiosity to wary dismissal when he took in her appearance. "We're not hiring," he said before she could even speak, his voice flat and final. "Business has been slow, and I can barely afford to keep my current help." Sarah's heart sank, but she forced a polite smile. "Please, sir, I'm willing to work for very little. I can clean, organize inventory, and help with customers. I learn quickly, and I'm reliable." The man shook his head, already turning back to his ledger. "Can't help you, miss. Try the saloon. They might need a girl to sweep up." The implication in his tone made Sarah's cheeks burn, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you for your time," she said quietly, and left the store with as much dignity as she could muster. This had been her routine for the past 3 weeks. After arriving in Cedar Falls on the last of her money from Denver, she had systematically approached every business in town. The seamstress had no work. The hotel was fully staffed. The restaurant owner had looked her up and down and suggested she might find other work if she was desperate enough. Even the church had turned her away when she'd offered to clean or help with Sunday services. Sarah walked slowly down the street, her feet aching in boots that were developing holes in the soles. She had been staying in a tiny room above Murphy's boarding house, paying by the day, but her funds were nearly exhausted. Tonight might be her last night with a roof over her head. As she approached the boarding house, she noticed a man sitting on the porch of the building next door. He was different from the other men she'd encountered in Cedar Falls, where most dressed in simple work clothes or business attire. This man wore well-made leather chaps over dark trousers, a clean white shirt beneath a leather vest, and a hat that had clearly been crafted by skilled hands rather than mass-produced. His boots were worn but well-maintained, and there was something about his posture that suggested both strength and patience. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and when he looked up from the piece of leather he was mending in his hands, Sarah caught sight of clear gray eyes that seemed to take in everything with quiet assessment. "Afternoon, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. Sarah nodded in response, too tired and discouraged to engage in conversation. She climbed the steps to Murphy's front door, fumbling for the key the proprietor had given her. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that suggested origins further south. "I couldn't help but notice you've been making Rounds to the businesses in town, looking for work? Sarah hesitated, her hand on the door handle. Something in his tone was different from the dismissive attitudes she'd encountered elsewhere. There was no judgment, no immediate rejection, just what seemed like genuine curiosity. "I am," she admitted, turning to face him more directly. "Though I'm beginning to think Cedar Falls has no need for an extra pair of hands." The man set down his leatherwork and stood, moving with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own body. He was taller than she had initially thought, probably 6 feet or so, but there was nothing intimidating about his manner. "I'm sorry to hear you're having difficulty," he said, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "Times have been hard for a lot of folks. What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything honest," Sarah replied, surprised by her own candor. "I can cook, clean, sew, tend to children, help with accounts. I worked in my family's general store. Back in Ohio before." She trailed off, not wanting to share the painful details of how she'd ended up alone and penniless in the Wyoming Territory. The man studied her for a moment, and Sarah found herself standing a little straighter under his gaze. Unlike the leering look she'd received from some men in town, his assessment seemed to be taking measure of her character rather than her appearance. "My name is Daniel Hayes," he said finally. "I own a ranch about 5 miles west of town. It's not a large operation, but it keeps me busy." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, hoping to stir despite her efforts to keep it in check. "Miss Mitchell, I find myself in need of help, though perhaps not the kind you've been seeking elsewhere." Daniel paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've been managing my household on my own for some time now, and I'll be honest, I'm not particularly good at it. The cooking is barely edible, the house is in desperate need of a woman's touch, and I spend far too much time on domestic chores when I should be focusing on the ranch." Sarah's pulse quickened. This sounded like exactly the kind of position she'd been hoping to find. "I would be very interested in such work, Mr. Hayes. I'm an excellent cook, and I take pride in keeping a clean, organized home." Daniel nodded slowly, but something in his expression suggested there was more to his offer than he'd yet revealed. "The thing is, Miss Mitchell, what I really need is a wife." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush. "I beg your pardon?" "I realize how that must sound," Daniel said quickly, holding up a hand. "I'm not suggesting anything improper. What I'm proposing is a business arrangement, if you will. A marriage of convenience that would benefit us both." Sarah stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "Mr. Hayes, I barely know you. We've been speaking for all of 5 minutes. I understand your surprise, and I don't expect an answer immediately. But hear me out." Daniel's voice remained calm and reasonable, as if you were discussing the purchase of cattle rather than proposing marriage to a complete stranger. "You need security, a home, and honest work. I need someone to manage my household, so I can focus on building my ranch into something substantial. We would both benefit from the arrangement." "But marriage," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that's a sacred bond, not a business transaction." "It can be both," Daniel replied gently. "I'm not asking for love, Miss Mitchell, though. I hope we might become friends over time. What I'm offering is partnership, mutual respect, and security. You would have your own room, complete authority over the household, and a share in whatever success the ranch achieves." Sarah's mind reeled. 3 weeks of rejection and dwindling funds had left her with few options, but marriage to a stranger seemed extreme even in her desperate circumstances. Yet there was something about Daniel Hayes that inspired trust. His manner was respectful, his proposal straightforward rather than manipulative, and she sensed no deception in his words. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Surely there are women in Cedar Falls who would be interested in such an arrangement." Daniel smiled, and the expression transformed his serious features. "There are few unmarried women in Cedar Falls, and fewer still, Who would consider such an unconventional proposal? Besides, I've watched you these past few days as you've made your rounds. You handle rejection with grace. You maintain your dignity even when others treat you poorly, and you haven't let desperation drive you to compromise your principles. Those are qualities I value. You've been watching me? Sarah wasn't sure whether to be flattered or alarmed. Cedar Falls isn't a large town, Miss Mitchell. Word travels when a young woman is looking for work. And yes, I've made it my business to observe your character before making this offer. Daniel's expression grew more serious. I won't lie to you about what you'd be getting into. Ranch life is hard work. The nearest neighbors are miles away, and winter can be isolating. But you'd have a home, security, and the freedom to make that home whatever you want it to be. Sarah looked down at her worn dress, her patched boots, the carpet bag that contained everything she owned in the world. The alternative to Daniel's offer was likely a return to the streets, with all the dangers that entailed for a woman alone. Yet marriage, even one of convenience, was not a step to be taken lightly. I would need time to consider your proposal, she said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. Daniel reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper, which he handed to her. This is directions to my ranch, should you decide to visit and see what you'd be taking on. There's also a standing invitation for Sunday dinner, if you'd like to get to know me better before making your decision. Sarah took the paper, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. His hands were calloused from hard work, but gentle in their touch. Mr. Hayes, may I ask why you haven't married for love? You seem like a good man, and I'm sure there are women who would be interested in genuine courtship. Daniel's expression grew distant, and for a moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. I was engaged once, he said finally, to a woman back in Texas before I came north. She decided ranch life wasn't for her and chose someone who could offer her a more comfortable life in the city. Since then, I've found it difficult to trust in romantic notions. A practical arrangement seems more honest somehow. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Sarah heard it nonetheless. Daniel Hayes had been hurt, just as she had been by the circumstances that brought her to Wyoming. Perhaps that common experience of disappointment was why his unusual proposal didn't seem quite as strange as it should have. I should go in, Sarah said, gesturing toward the boarding house door. Mrs. Murphy will be expecting me for dinner. Of course. Miss Mitchell, Daniel called as she turned away. Whatever you decide, know that the offer comes with no strings attached. If you choose to decline, I'll respect your decision completely. And I'll do what I can to help you find other employment in town. Sarah nodded, touched by his consideration. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, for the offer and for treating me with such kindness. As she climbed the stairs to her small room, Sarah's mind churned with the possibilities and implications of Daniel's proposal. Marriage to a stranger was certainly not how she had imagined her life unfolding when she left Ohio. She had dreamed of finding love, of building a family based on affection and mutual devotion. But dreams, she had learned, often had to yield to reality. She sat on the narrow bed and opened the small Bible her mother had given her, seeking comfort in its familiar pages. Her mother had been a practical woman who had married Sarah's father, not for passionate love, but for security and companionship. Over the years, they had built a strong partnership and eventually genuine affection. Perhaps such things were possible even in unconventional circumstances. That evening at dinner, Sarah found herself studying the other residents of Murphy's boarding house with new eyes. There was old Pete, a prospector whose best days were behind him, living on the charity of others. Mrs. Henley, a widow who took in sewing to make ends meet, her fingers permanently stained from dye and her back bent from years of close work. Young Tom Bradley, barely 18, who spent his days looking for any odd job that would pay enough for his next meal. This was what awaited her. If she couldn't find steady employment, a slow slide into poverty and desperation, dependent on the kindness of others and vulnerable to those who might take advantage of her circumstances. Daniel Hayes was offering her an alternative, unconventional though it might be. After dinner, Sarah walked out onto the boarding house porch, hoping the evening air might clear her thoughts. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of the sunsets back home in Ohio. Those days seemed like a lifetime ago now, before her father's death, before the creditors had claimed everything, before she had been forced to strike out on her own with nothing but hope and determination. Lovely evening, isn't it? Sarah turned to find Mrs. Murphy, the boarding house proprietor, stepping onto the porch with a cup of coffee in her hands. She was a woman in her 50s, weathered by frontier life, but possessed of a kind heart and sharp wit. "Yes, it is," Sarah agreed, making room for the older woman to join her on the porch swing. "I hear you had an interesting conversation with Daniel Hayes today," Mrs. Murphy said, settling beside her with a slight grunt. Word travels fast in a small town. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. Did it seem so unusual? Mrs. Murphy chuckled. "Honey, in a place like Cedar Falls, a conversation between an unmarried man and woman is noteworthy. Especially when that man is Daniel Hayes." "What do you mean?" "He's something of a mystery around here," Mrs. Murphy explained, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. "Showed up about 2 years ago with enough money to buy the old Henderson place, but no one knows much about his past. He keeps to himself mostly, comes to town for supplies and church on Sundays, but doesn't socialize much. Some folks think he's running from something, but I believe he's just a man who values his privacy." Sarah absorbed this information, adding it to her growing understanding of the man who had made such an unexpected proposal. "What kind of reputation does he have?" "Solid as they come," Mrs. Murphy replied without hesitation. "Pays his debts on time, treats folks with respect, and I've never heard a word against his character. He helped the widow Patterson repair her roof last spring without being asked, and when the Miller boy got lost in a blizzard last winter, Daniel was one of the men who rode out in the storm to find him." This painted a picture of a good man, someone who acted from principle rather than self-interest. Sarah found herself more intrigued than ever by Daniel Hayes and his unusual proposal. "Mrs. Murphy," Sarah said carefully, "if you were in my position, what would you do?" The older woman was quiet for a long moment, rocking gently in the swing. "That depends on what you're looking for in life, dear. If you're holding out for a passionate romance, then Daniel's offer isn't for you. But if you want security, respect, and the chance to build something meaningful, well, you could do a lot worse than Daniel Hayes." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah found herself considering not just the practical aspects of Daniel's proposal, but the man himself. There had been something in his eyes when he spoke of his former fiancée, a depth of feeling that suggested he was capable of genuine emotion, even if he chose to guard his heart carefully. Perhaps a marriage built on mutual respect and shared goals could evolve into something deeper over time. The next morning, Sarah woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in weeks. She dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a deep green wool that complemented her dark hair, and pinned her hair into a neat chignon. If she was going to visit Daniel's ranch, she wanted to present herself as the competent, dignified woman she aspired to be. After a simple breakfast, she walked to Miller's livery stable, where she inquired about renting a horse for the day. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Jake Miller, looked skeptical. "You sure you can handle riding out to Hayes' place alone, miss? It's a fair distance, and the trail can be tricky if you don't know it." "I'm an experienced rider, Mr. Miller," Sarah assured him, though it had been months since she'd been on horseback. And Mr. Hayes provided clear directions. Miller shrugged and saddled a gentle mare named Rosie, giving Sarah detailed instructions about the route and warning her to be back before dark. As she rode out of town, Sarah felt a freedom she hadn't experienced since arriving in Wyoming. The open country stretched before her, vast and beautiful under the morning sun, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope that her future might hold more than mere survival. The ride to Daniel's ranch took her through rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and wildflowers, following a well-maintained trail that spoke of frequent use. As she crested a final hill, the ranch spread out below her, and Sarah caught her breath at the sight. It was more substantial than she had expected. A large, two-story house built of logs and stone sat at the center of the property, surrounded by well-tended gardens and several outbuildings. Corrals held a number of horses, and she could see cattle grazing in distant pastures. This was not the struggling homestead she had imagined, but a prosperous operation that spoke of hard work and careful planning. Daniel emerged from the barn as she approached, and she noticed he had taken care with his appearance as well. His shirt was clean and pressed, his hair neatly combed, and he moved toward her with the same quiet confidence she had observed in town. "Miss Mitchell," he said, helping her down from the mare with courteous attention. "I'm pleased you decided to visit. Welcome to the Double H Ranch." As Sarah looked around at the evidence of Daniel's success, she began to understand that his proposal might offer more than mere security. Here was a man who had built something substantial from nothing, who had the vision and determination to create a life of real prosperity. If she accepted his offer, she wouldn't just be gaining shelter and food, but the opportunity to be part of something meaningful and growing. The question remained, was she brave enough to take such an unprecedented step, and could she find happiness in a marriage that began as a business arrangement rather than a love story? Daniel led Sarah toward the house, his stride confident but unhurried. The porch wrapped around the front and side of the building, supported by thick wooden posts that had been carved with simple but elegant details. Flower boxes beneath the windows held wilted remnants of what had once been a garden, evidence of a man's well-intentioned but unsuccessful attempts at domesticity. "I apologize for the state of things," Daniel said as they climbed the front steps. "I told you I wasn't very good at household management." Sarah noticed the way he held the door for her, the careful attention to courtesy that suggested good upbringing despite his current bachelor circumstances. The interior of the house was both impressive and heartbreaking. The rooms were spacious and well-proportioned, with large windows that let in abundant natural light. The furniture was solid and well-made, clearly chosen with care rather than simply for practicality. But everywhere Sarah looked, she saw the signs of a man living alone who had given up trying to create a proper home. Dust gathered on surfaces that should have gleamed. Dishes were stacked haphazardly in the kitchen, clean but without any sense of order. Books were piled on tables instead of arranged on the shelves that had obviously been built for them. It wasn't dirty, exactly, but it lacked the touches that transformed a house into a home. "The parlor," Daniel said, gesturing to a room with a stone fireplace and comfortable chairs arranged around a rug that had seen better days. "I spend most of my evenings here when I'm not working." Sarah could see the potential in every room. With proper care and attention, this could be a showcase home, the kind of place where a family could thrive and guests would feel welcomed. Her fingers itched to start organizing, to bring order and beauty to spaces that clearly had good bones, but lacked a woman's touch. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, running her hand along a mantelpiece that needed polishing but was made of beautiful dark wood. 2 years this October. I bought the place from a family that was moving back east after the father died. They were eager to sell, so I got it for a fair price, along with the stock and equipment. Daniel's voice carried pride mixed with something that might have been loneliness. "It's more house than one man needs, honestly." They moved through the dining room, with its large table capable of seating 8, and into the kitchen. This was clearly where Daniel spent most of his domestic time. The stove was well maintained, the pantry stocked with basic supplies, but everything was arranged with purely functional considerations. Pots and pans hung where they were convenient rather than where they looked best. Dishes were stacked without regard for matching sets. "I can cook the basics," Daniel said, noting her assessment of the space. "Eggs, bacon, beef, beans. Nothing fancy, but it keeps me fed." Sarah opened a few cabinets, noting good quality dishes and cookware that weren't being used to their potential. "You have excellent equipment here. With proper organization and planning, this kitchen could produce meals worthy of the finest restaurants." "Is that something you enjoy, cooking?" "Very much. My mother taught me that a well-prepared meal is one of life's greatest pleasures. She used to say that food prepared with care nourishes more than just the body." Sarah found herself smiling at the memory. "I had to take over most of the cooking when she became ill, and I discovered I had a talent for it." They continued the tour upstairs, where Daniel showed her 4 bedrooms, including the master suite he currently occupied. The room he indicated would be hers was spacious and bright, with windows facing east toward the mountains. It had its own small fireplace and enough space for a sitting area as well as sleeping quarters. "Complete privacy," Daniel said, standing carefully in the doorway rather than entering the room. "Your space would be entirely your own." Sarah appreciated both his consideration and his restraint. Many men in his position might have tried to push the boundaries of propriety, but Daniel seemed genuinely committed to the respectful arrangement he had proposed. From the bedroom window, she could see the ranch operations spread out below. Several men were working with horses in one of the corrals, their movements suggesting long experience with the animals. The cattle in the distant pastures looked healthy and well tended. This was clearly a successful enterprise, not the desperate gamble of a man with nothing to lose. "You have employees," she observed. 3 full-time ranch hands and 2 part-time workers who help during busy seasons. Good men, all of them. They have their own bunkhouse and take their meals there, so you wouldn't be responsible for cooking for them unless you chose to do so. This was important information. Sarah had wondered if accepting Daniel's proposal would mean becoming a servant to his entire operation. Knowing that her responsibilities would be limited to the main house and Daniel himself made the arrangement seem more manageable and dignified. They returned to the kitchen, where Daniel put coffee on to brew with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to providing for himself. Sarah noticed that he had good instincts about hospitality, despite his admitted failures at household management. "Miss Mitchell," Daniel said as they waited for the coffee, "I want to be completely honest with you about what this arrangement would entail. I'm not looking for a housekeeper I can dismiss at will, nor am I seeking a wife who would be subservient to my every wish. What I'm proposing is a true partnership." Sarah settled into one of the kitchen chairs, noting how comfortable the furniture was despite its simple construction. "What exactly do you mean by partnership?" "I mean that major decisions about the ranch and our life here would be made together. The household would be entirely under your authority. You would have access to household funds to purchase whatever you felt was necessary. And if the ranch continues to prosper as I expect it will, you would benefit from that success. And if it doesn't prosper?" Daniel's expression grew serious. "Then we would face those difficulties together. I won't lie to you about the risks involved in ranching. Weather, market prices, disease among the cattle, any number of things could impact our success. But I've been careful to build on solid foundations, and I believe we have a good chance of continued growth." The coffee finished brewing, and Daniel served it in cups that didn't match but were clean and well maintained. Sarah noticed that he took his black, while she added a small amount of sugar from a bowl he provided. "May I ask about your financial situation?" Sarah inquired, then quickly added, "I don't mean to pry, but if we're discussing a business partnership, It seems relevant. Of course. I have enough saved to carry us through 2 bad years, assuming reasonable expenses. The ranch currently generates sufficient income to cover our needs and allow for modest expansion. I own the land free and clear, along with all the buildings and equipment. This was more security than Sarah had dared hope for. She had been prepared to accept an arrangement that provided little more than shelter and food, but Daniel was offering genuine prosperity and the potential for even greater success. What would happen if you became ill or injured? What would my position be then? Daniel nodded approvingly at the question. I've already spoken to my lawyer about that possibility. If something happened to me, you would inherit the ranch and all assets, along with enough cash to hire help for anything you couldn't manage yourself. You would never find yourself destitute and alone again. The promise touched something deep in Sarah's heart. Since her father's death, she had lived with the constant fear of ending up with nothing, dependent on the charity of others or forced into desperate circumstances. Daniel was offering her true security, the kind that couldn't be taken away by a single misfortune. This seems very generous to you, she said carefully. What assurance do you have that I wouldn't simply take advantage of your offer? Daniel smiled, and Sarah realized it was the first time she had seen him look genuinely amused. Miss Mitchell, you've spent 3 weeks looking for honest work rather than accepting the less savory opportunities that were undoubtedly available to a woman in your circumstances. You've maintained your dignity and principles despite facing genuine hardship. Those aren't the actions of someone who would take advantage of another's generosity. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping their coffee and watching the late morning sun slant through the kitchen windows. Sarah found herself studying Daniel's profile, noting the strong jaw and the lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours spent squinting into the sun. His hands wrapped around the coffee cup were scarred from work, but clean and well cared for. May I ask you something personal? Sarah ventured, of course. Your former fiancé, the one who chose city life over ranch life. Do you think she made the right decision? Daniel was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she had overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than bitter. For her, probably. Elizabeth wasn't suited to this kind of life. She needed society, entertainment, the kinds of opportunities that only a city can provide. I was asking her to give up who she was to become someone else, and that wasn't fair to either of us. But it hurt you. Yes, it did. Not just the rejection, but the realization that I had been so focused on what I wanted that I hadn't really considered what she needed. Daniel met Sarah's eyes directly. That's part of why I'm approaching this differently. I'm not asking you to pretend to be someone you're not, or to sacrifice your essential self for my vision of what a wife should be. Sarah found herself respecting Daniel's honesty and self-reflection. Many men would have blamed the woman entirely or refused to examine their own role in the failed relationship. What if we find that we simply can't get along? She asked. What? If we're incompatible in ways we can't foresee? Then we would discuss it honestly and find solutions together. I'm not naive enough to think that any marriage, even one based on practical considerations, won't face challenges. Daniel finished his coffee and set the cup aside. But I believe that 2 reasonable people who share common goals can overcome most difficulties through communication and compromise. After their conversation, Daniel showed Sarah the rest of the ranch operation. They visited the barn, where she met his horses and saw the quality of care he provided for his animals. The tack room was organized with military precision, every piece of equipment properly maintained and in its place. You're very orderly when it comes to ranch work, she observed. A man's life can depend on his equipment being in good repair and easy to find, Daniel replied. I learned that during my Army service. You were a soldier? For 3 years, right after the war ended. Cavalry unit stationed in New Mexico Territory. dealing with Apache raids and cattle rustlers. Daniel's tone was matter-of-fact, but Sarah sensed there were stories behind his service that he wasn't ready to share. They walked through the vegetable garden, or what remained of one. Daniel had clearly made an effort, but the plants were struggling from improper care and attention. "I'm better with cattle than with carrots," he admitted ruefully. Sarah knelt beside a row of tomatoes that were dying from both over and under, watering in different sections. "These could still be saved with proper care, and this soil is excellent for vegetables. You could have a garden that would supply most of your food needs through the growing season. Could you manage something like that?" "I grew up helping with my family's garden. It was one of my responsibilities from the time I was old enough to hold a watering can." Sarah stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "I actually find garden work very satisfying." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah found herself imagining what life could be like here. She could picture herself in the kitchen, preparing meals that used fresh vegetables from a thriving garden. She could see herself arranging the rooms to show off their natural beauty, creating spaces that would be both comfortable and elegant. The work would be hard, but it would be purposeful, building something lasting rather than simply surviving from day to day. "Miss Mitchell," Daniel said as they reached the porch, "I want to make you an offer that might make your decision easier." "What kind of offer?" "Stay for a week. As my guest, nothing more. Take meals with me, see what daily life here would be like, get a real sense of whether this arrangement could work for both of us." Daniel's expression was earnest but not pressuring. "At the end of the week, if you decide it's not right for you, I'll pay for your transportation to wherever you want to go and provide enough money to support you while you look for other opportunities." Sarah felt her heart skip. It was an incredibly generous offer, one that provided her with real choice rather than forcing her into a decision based purely on desperation. "And if I decide to accept your original proposal, then we could be married the following Sunday, and you would begin your new life here with no reservations about what you were getting into." The practical part of Sarah's mind recognized the wisdom in Daniel's suggestion. A week would give her time to observe his character, to see how he treated his employees and handled the daily challenges of ranch life. It would also allow her to assess whether she could be happy in such an isolated location, away from the society and culture she had been accustomed to. There would be nothing improper about such an arrangement. She asked, "You would have complete privacy and autonomy. Mrs. Patterson, our nearest neighbor, could chaperone if that would make you more comfortable. She's a widow who lives about 3 miles south of here, and she's been after me to find a wife for the past year." Sarah almost smiled at the image of a matchmaking neighbor. "She approves of your unconventional approach to courtship. Mrs. Patterson believes that practical marriages often turn out better than romantic ones. Her own marriage was arranged by her parents, and she says it was very happy once she and her husband got to know each other." As Daniel prepared to escort her back to town, Sarah found herself already mentally rearranging his kitchen, planning meals that would use his excellent cookware to better advantage, imagining curtains for the windows that would soften the harsh afternoon light. Was it possible that she had found not just security, but a real opportunity for happiness? The ride back to Cedar Falls gave Sarah time to process everything she had seen and heard. Daniel Hayes was clearly an honorable man offering a genuine partnership rather than exploitation. His ranch was prosperous and well managed, his character apparently solid, his intentions straightforward. If she was going to rebuild her life, she could hardly ask for better circumstances. But could she truly be happy in a marriage that began as a business arrangement? Could she find satisfaction in caring for a man she respected but didn't love? And was it fair to Daniel to accept his offer when her heart might always long for the romantic love she had once dreamed of finding? As Cedar Falls came into view, Sarah realized that her week of observation would be as much about examining her own heart as it would be about assessing Daniel's suitability as a husband. The question wasn't just whether she could make such a marriage work, but whether she could find joy and fulfillment in building a life based on partnership rather than passion. The decision that had seemed so overwhelming just days before was beginning to clarify in her mind. Daniel Hayes had offered her more than just survival. He had offered her a chance to be part of something meaningful, to build a life of substance and security. Whether that life could include happiness remained to be seen, but for the first time since leaving Ohio, Sarah felt as though she might have found her path forward. Sarah spent a sleepless night weighing Daniel's offer. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would accept his invitation to spend a week at the ranch, though she told herself it was merely to gather information, rather than because she had already begun to hope this unconventional arrangement might work. Mrs. Murphy was less surprised by the decision than Sarah had expected. Over breakfast, the older woman nodded approvingly as Sarah explained her plans. "Daniel Hayes is a good man," Mrs. Murphy said, refilling Sarah's coffee cup. "And you're a sensible woman. Sometimes the best marriages are built on respect and shared goals, rather than wild passion that burns out after a few years. But what if we find we simply can't tolerate each other? What if I'm making a terrible mistake? Then you'll have learned something valuable, and you'll still be better off than you are now," Mrs. Murphy replied practically. "Besides, from what I've observed, you two are more compatible than you might think. You're both thoughtful, hardworking people who value integrity. That's a stronger foundation than many marriages have." Sarah packed her few belongings with care, uncertain whether she would be returning to Murphy's boarding house or beginning a new life at the Double H Ranch. The uncertainty was both terrifying and exhilarating. Daniel arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, as promised, driving a well-maintained wagon rather than riding horseback. He had clearly given thought to her comfort and the propriety of the situation. "Miss Mitchell," he said, tipping his hat as he helped her into the wagon seat, "I appreciate you giving this arrangement serious consideration." The journey to the ranch passed more quickly than Sarah's previous visit, filled with conversation about practical matters that would concern both of them if they proceeded with the marriage. Daniel proved to be an engaged conversationalist, asking thoughtful questions about her background and sharing details about his own history that he hadn't mentioned before. "I was born in Kansas," he told her as they followed the winding trail through the hills. "My father was a farmer, but the land was hard and the weather unpredictable. After he died, I sold the farm and joined the Army, figuring I needed to see more of the world before I settled down anywhere permanently." "What made you choose Wyoming territory for your ranch?" "The land was available at reasonable prices, and I liked the idea of building something from nothing. Plus, the climate is better for cattle than farming, and there's good access to railroad lines for shipping beef to market." Daniel guided the horses around a particularly rough section of trail. "I spent 6 months researching different areas before I made my decision. This seemed to offer the best combination of opportunity and stability." Sarah appreciated his methodical approach to major decisions. It suggested that his proposal to her had been similarly well considered rather than impulsive. When they reached the ranch, Sarah was struck again by how substantial and well-maintained everything appeared. Daniel's 3 ranch hands were working in one of the corrals, breaking a young horse with patience and skill. They touched their hats respectfully as the wagon passed, but didn't interrupt their work for extended greetings. "Jack, Miguel, and Tom," Daniel said, indicating the 3 men. "They've been with me since I bought the place, and they know the operation better than anyone. You'll find them respectful and hardworking." Daniel carried Sarah's bag to the house, showing her once again to the room that would be hers during the trial period. In daylight, it was even more appealing than she had remembered, with morning sun streaming through clean windows and a view of the mountains that took her breath away. "I've arranged for Mrs. Patterson to join us for dinner this evening," Daniel said from the doorway. "I thought you might appreciate having another woman to talk with. and she's been eager to meet you." "That was very thoughtful. What should I expect from Mrs. Patterson?" Daniel smiled. "She's forthright to the point of being blunt, generous with advice whether you ask for it or not, and utterly devoted to the welfare of her neighbors. She lost her husband 2 years ago and has been the unofficial guardian of everyone in the area ever since, left alone to settle into her temporary quarters." Sarah unpacked her few belongings and arranged them carefully in the dresser and wardrobe. The room felt spacious and luxurious after her cramped quarters at Murphy's boarding house, and she found herself imagining how she might decorate it if she decided to stay. From her window, she could observe the daily workings of the ranch. The 3 hands moved with the easy efficiency of men who had worked together for a long time, tending to the horses and cattle with obvious skill and care. She noticed that Daniel joined them in their work, not standing apart as the boss, but participating fully in the physical labor required to keep the operation running. This impressed her. Many men in his position would have considered manual labor beneath their dignity once they could afford to hire others to do it. Daniel's willingness to work alongside his employees suggested both humility and practical wisdom. Around midday, Sarah ventured into the kitchen to explore the provisions Daniel had available. She found the pantry well stocked with basic ingredients, but lacking many of the items that would allow for varied and interesting meals. The spice collection was particularly limited, consisting mainly of salt, pepper, and a few herbs that had clearly been purchased but never used. Acting on impulse, Sarah decided to prepare lunch for Daniel and his men. It would give her something useful to do and allow her to test both the kitchen facilities and her potential role in the household routine. She found enough ingredients to make a substantial pot of beef stew, using techniques her mother had taught her to coax maximum flavor from simple components. She also mixed up a batch of biscuits, grateful to find that Daniel had quality flour and fresh butter available. When the men came in for their midday break, they were clearly surprised to find hot food waiting for them in the kitchen. "Miss Mitchell," Daniel said, with obvious pleasure in his voice, "you didn't need to go to this trouble." "It was no trouble at all. I wanted to familiarize myself with the kitchen, and cooking for 4 instead of 1 seemed like a better test of the facilities." The ranch hands introduced themselves properly, removing their hats and speaking with respectful courtesy. Jack Morrison was the oldest, a man in his 40s with gray threading his brown hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent his life outdoors. Miguel Santos was younger, perhaps 30, with the easy smile and careful manners of someone who had been raised to respect women above all else. Tom Bradley was barely 20, eager and hardworking, but still learning the finer points of ranch management. "Ma'am," Jack said after tasting the stew, "this is the finest meal we've had in months. Mr. Hayes does his best, but his cooking runs more to the basic side of things." Daniel laughed good-naturedly at the gentle criticism. Jack's being diplomatic. "My cooking runs more to the barely edible side of things." The easy relationship between Daniel and his employees impressed Sarah. There was clearly mutual respect and affection, suggesting that Daniel was a fair and considerate employer. This boded well for how he might treat a wife, even one married. For practical rather than romantic reasons, after lunch, Daniel offered to show Sarah more of the ranch operation. They rode out to check on the cattle, and Sarah was struck by the size and quality of the herd. These were healthy, well-bred animals that would command good prices at market. "How many heads do you currently run?" she asked as they watched the cattle graze in a meadow bordered by a clear stream. "About 300 now, but I plan to expand to 500 over the next 2 years if the market remains strong." Daniel dismounted to check a section of fence that appeared to need repair. The key is to build slowly and never overextend. "I've seen too many ranchers go under because they expanded too quickly and couldn't weather a bad season or market downturn." Sarah appreciated his conservative approach to business growth. It suggested the same careful planning he seemed to apply to all aspects of his life, including his unconventional approach to marriage. As they rode back toward the house, Sarah found herself relaxing in Daniel's company. He was an easy companion, knowledgeable about his work, but not condescending when he explained things she didn't understand. He listened carefully to her questions and observations, treating her opinions with respect, even when they differed from his own. "Daniel," she said as they approached the barn, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you ever get lonely out here? It's a beautiful country, but it's very isolated." Daniel was quiet for a moment, unsaddling his horse with practiced movements. "Yes," he said finally. "Especially in the evenings and during the winter months when there's less work to occupy my time. I've gotten used to my own company, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss having someone to share meals with, to talk about the day's events, to plan for the future." His honesty touched something in Sarah's heart. She had been so focused on her own need for security that she hadn't fully considered what Daniel might be hoping to gain from their arrangement beyond household management. "Is that why you decided to seek a wife rather than simply hiring a housekeeper?" "Partly, but also because I want to build something lasting, something that will matter beyond just my own lifetime. A partnership with shared goals seems more likely to create that kind of legacy than a simple employment arrangement." That evening, Mrs. Patterson arrived for dinner precisely at 6 o'clock, driving her own buggy with the competent skill of a woman accustomed to managing her own affairs. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair arranged in a practical style and intelligent blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "So you're the young woman who's got Daniel thinking about marriage," she said without preamble, clasping Sarah's hand warmly. "I'm delighted to meet you, my dear. It's past time he found himself a suitable wife." Sarah found herself smiling at the woman's directness. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Patterson. Daniel tells me you're the unofficial guardian of everyone in the area. Somebody has to look after these stubborn men. Left to their own devices, they'd work themselves to death and never think to eat a proper meal or mend their clothes." Mrs. Patterson settled herself in the parlor with the air of someone completely at home. "Now tell me about yourself. Daniel says you're from Ohio originally." Over dinner, which Sarah had prepared using more of Daniel's underutilized ingredients, Mrs. Patterson proved to be both entertaining and perceptive. She drew out details of Sarah's background with skillful questioning while sharing stories of her own life and the challenges of frontier living. "My own marriage was arranged by my parents," Mrs. Patterson said as they lingered over coffee. "I was 16 and scared to death of leaving home to marry a man I'd met exactly 3 times. But Robert turned out to be the kindest, most honorable man I ever knew. We had 32 happy years together before the fever took him." "How long did it take before you felt truly comfortable with the arrangement?" Sarah asked. "Oh, about 6 months, I'd say. That's how long it took us to stop being polite strangers and start being honest with each other about what we wanted from our life together." Mrs. Patterson smiled at the memory. "The love came later, gradually, built on respect and shared experiences. But it was real and lasting, perhaps more so than the passionate attachments that burn hot and then flame out." After Mrs. Patterson left, Sarah helped Daniel clean the dinner dishes, working together in the kitchen with an ease that surprised them both. Their conversation flowed naturally as they worked, covering topics from books they had read to their opinions on various political issues of the day. "You have more books than I expected," Sarah observed, noting the well-stocked shelves in the parlor. "Reading helps pass the long winter evenings. What about you? What do you enjoy reading?" "Everything I can get my hands on. Novels, poetry, newspapers. When I can find them. My father believed that education was equally important for daughters as for sons." Sarah dried a plate with careful attention. "I miss having access to new books and periodicals." Cedar Falls has a small library, and I could arrange for subscriptions to magazines and newspapers if that would interest you." The casual way he said it, as if her intellectual interests were important and worthy of consideration, moved Sarah more than she had expected. Many men would have considered such things frivolous expenses for a woman. As they finished the dishes and prepared to retire for the evening, Sarah realized that the day had passed more pleasantly than any she could remember since leaving Ohio. She had felt useful, appreciated, and intellectually engaged. If this was a sample of what married life with Daniel Hayes might offer, it seemed like a future worth considering seriously. But as she prepared for bed in her comfortable temporary quarters, Sarah found herself wondering about the aspects of marriage that Daniel's practical arrangement didn't address. Physical intimacy, romantic love, the deep emotional connection she had always imagined sharing with a husband. Could a marriage be truly satisfying without those elements, even if it provided security and companionship? The question would require careful consideration over the remaining days of her trial visit. But for tonight, Sarah fell asleep feeling more hopeful about her future than she had in months, lulled by the sounds of the Wyoming night and the knowledge that she was safe, valued, and possibly on the verge of finding a new kind of happiness. Sarah's third day at the Double H Ranch began with an unexpected visitor. She was in the garden behind the house, attempting to salvage what remained of Daniel's struggling vegetables, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats caught her attention. A lone rider was approaching from the east, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual visiting. Daniel emerged from the barn, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver he wore at his hip. The gesture was so subtle that Sarah might have missed it if she hadn't been watching him carefully. The rider was a stranger to her, but Daniel's posture suggested he recognized the man and wasn't entirely pleased by his arrival. "Nathaniel Cross," Daniel said as the rider dismounted, his tone carefully neutral. "Wasn't expecting to see you out this way." Cross was a well-dressed man in his 40s, with the soft look of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the saddle. His clothes were expensive but practical, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way in business dealings. "Daniel, good to see you." Cross's smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached. "I was in the area checking on some property investments and thought I'd stop by to discuss that offer I made last month." Sarah noticed that Daniel didn't invite Cross into the house or offer him refreshments, maintaining their conversation in the open yard where others could observe. This struck her as significant, though she wasn't sure why. "I told you then that the ranch wasn't for sale, Nathaniel. Nothing's changed." "Everything changes, my friend. Market conditions, personal circumstances, opportunities that might not come again." Cross's gaze shifted to Sarah, who was still kneeling among the tomato plants, but clearly within earshot. "I see you have company. Perhaps we should speak privately." "Miss Mitchell is a guest here, and anything you have to say can be said in front of her." Daniel's voice carried a subtle warning that made Sarah pay closer attention to the conversation. Cross shrugged, apparently unconcerned by the audience. "Very well. Daniel, I'm prepared to increase my offer by 20%. That's a substantial sum for a ranch this size, especially considering the challenges facing cattle ranchers in this territory." "What challenges would those be?" "Oh, the usual things: drought, disease, fluctuating beef prices. And of course, there are always concerns about the railroad rates for shipping cattle to market. Sometimes those rates can change quite suddenly, making previously profitable operations less so." Something in Cross's tone made Sarah look up from her gardening. The man's words seemed innocent enough, but there was an undercurrent that suggested more than casual business discussion. Daniel's expression had hardened almost imperceptibly. "The railroad rates are set by contract, Nathaniel. They can't be changed arbitrarily. Contracts can be renegotiated when circumstances warrant it, or when certain influential parties believe changes would be beneficial to all concerned. Cross smiled again, and Sarah felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. I'm simply pointing out that a smart businessman takes offers when they're available rather than waiting for conditions to become less favorable. I appreciate your concern for my business welfare, Daniel replied, his voice now carrying a distinct edge. But I'm not interested in selling. Not at any price. Cross nodded as if he had expected this response. I understand your attachment to this place. A man invests time and effort. He develops sentimental feelings. But sentiment doesn't pay bills or protect against unforeseen difficulties. He glanced around the ranch with the calculating gaze of someone assessing property values. Think about my offer, Daniel. Market conditions can change very quickly in this territory. After Cross rode away, Daniel remained standing in the yard for several minutes, his expression troubled. Sarah finished her work in the garden and approached him, sensing that something significant had just occurred. Who was that man? She asked directly. Daniel looked at her for a moment, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. Nathaniel Cross owns several businesses in Cheyenne. He's been buying up ranches throughout the territory, supposedly for a consortium of Eastern investors. And you don't believe that's his real purpose? I think Nathaniel Cross does whatever benefits Nathaniel Cross, and I've never known him to make business decisions based on sentiment or fair dealing. Daniel's jaw was tight with controlled anger. He's made several offers for ranches in this area, always at prices well above market value. Sarah absorbed this information, understanding that there were currents running beneath the surface of the conversation she had witnessed. What happens to the ranchers who sell to him? Most of them seem to disappear from the territory entirely. Whether that's by choice or necessity, I couldn't say. Daniel turned toward the house. Come inside, Sarah. There are things you should know before you make your decision about our arrangement. In the parlor, Daniel poured himself a whiskey despite the early hour, then settled into his chair with the weary air of a man carrying burdens he hadn't shared. 3 months ago, a rancher named Bill Henderson sold his place to Cross. Henderson had been struggling financially, so the generous offer seemed like a blessing. A week after the sale was finalized, Henderson was found dead near the railroad tracks outside Cheyenne, officially ruled an accident. Sarah felt her blood chill. But you don't think it was an accident? Henderson was an experienced horseman who had lived in this territory for 15 years. The idea that he would accidentally ride too close to a moving train strains credibility. Daniel took a sip of his whiskey. 2 weeks later, Jim Morrison, who had been thinking about accepting Cross's offer for his ranch, changed his mind and decided to keep his property. And what happened to Morrison? His prize bull died mysteriously. His water well was contaminated with something that made his cattle sick. His barn burned down under suspicious circumstances. Daniel's expression was grim. Morrison sold to Cross within the month. The implications were becoming clear to Sarah, and she didn't like what she was understanding. This Mr. Cross is using intimidation and possibly violence to force ranchers to sell their property. That's what I believe, though proving it would be difficult. Cross is careful to maintain legal distance from any incidents, and the local law enforcement seems reluctant to investigate too closely. Daniel finished his drink and set the glass aside. Which brings me to the point I need you to understand. Before you make your decision about staying here. Sarah felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. What point is that? If you marry me and make this ranch your home, you'll be sharing whatever dangers come with refusing Cross's offers. I won't lie to you about that risk, even though it might influence your decision. The weight of this revelation settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. She had been so focused on the personal aspects of Daniel's proposal that she hadn't considered external threats that might affect their safety and security. How serious do you think the danger is? Serious enough that I've taken precautions. The ranch hands are all armed and know to be alert for trouble. I've reinforced the locks on the way. House and barn. and I keep weapons readily available." Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But I can't guarantee your safety, Sarah. If you stay here, if you become my wife, you'll be taking on risks that go beyond the normal challenges of ranch life." Sarah rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful, pastoral scene of cattle grazing in distant fields. It was hard to believe that such beauty could mask danger, but she had learned that appearances could be deceiving. "Why haven't you considered accepting Cross's offer? Surely no property is worth risking your life. This ranch represents everything I've worked for since leaving the Army. More than that, it represents the possibility of building something lasting, something that matters." Daniel joined her at the window. "I won't be driven off by threats and intimidation. If I give in to Cross, what's to stop the next man who decides he wants what I've built?" Sarah understood the principle Daniel was defending, but she also understood the practical implications of his refusal to compromise. "What about your ranch hands? Are they aware of the situation? They know enough to be cautious, and they've chosen to stay despite the risks. Jack Morrison has family in the area, and he won't be driven out. Miguel sends most of his wages to his family in New Mexico, and he needs steady work. Tom is young enough to think himself invincible." Daniel's smile was rueful. "They're good men, and they deserve to know what they're getting into. Just as I deserve to know what I would be getting into." "Exactly. Sarah, I won't blame you if this changes your mind about our arrangement. The offer of transportation and support still stands, regardless of your decision." Sarah remained at the window for several minutes, processing everything Daniel had told her. The security she had thought she was finding might prove to be an illusion if Cross's threats escalated to violence. On the other hand, where else could she go that would offer greater safety? A woman alone was vulnerable anywhere, and at least here she would have Daniel's protection and support. "Has Cross made any direct threats against you personally?" "Not in so many words, but his meaning was clear enough. The comment about railroad rates wasn't casual conversation. Cross has connections with the Territorial Railroad Commission, and he could make shipping my cattle extremely expensive if he chose to do so. And that would ruin your business. It would make the ranch unprofitable, yes. I could survive for a while on my savings, but eventually I'd be forced to sell or lose everything." Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The frustrating thing is that Cross is probably within his legal rights to manipulate the system that way. Corruption isn't illegal if it's done through proper channels." Sarah turned from the window to face Daniel directly. "What would happen if you married me and Cross decided to escalate his campaign against you? He might try to use you as leverage against me. Threatening harm to my wife would be an effective way to pressure me into selling." Daniel's honesty was brutal, but appreciated. "That's why I had to tell you about this situation. You have the right to know all the risks before making your decision." The afternoon passed quietly, with both Sarah and Daniel lost in their own thoughts. She helped prepare dinner while he tended to ranch business, but their usual easy conversation was subdued by the weight of Cross's visit and its implications. That evening, after the ranch hands had finished their meal and returned to the bunkhouse, Sarah and Daniel sat on the front porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. The beauty of the scene was undimmed by their concerns, but Sarah found herself scanning the landscape for signs of potential threats rather than simply enjoying the view. "Daniel," she said finally, "if you were in my position, what would you do?" "I'd make the decision based on what I could live with long term," he replied after consideration. "Could I live with the regret of walking away from something that might have been good because I was afraid of what might happen? Or could I live with the consequences if the worst fears came true? That's not a very comforting answer. I'm not trying to comfort you into making a decision that's wrong for you. I'm trying to help you think through all the factors so you can make the choice that's right for your circumstances and temperament." Sarah appreciated his approach. even though it made her decision more difficult rather than easier. A man who was simply trying to convince her to stay might have downplayed the risks or offered false assurances. Daniel's honesty, while troubling, demonstrated the respect he claimed to have for her judgment and autonomy. "There's something else you should know," Daniel said as the last light faded from the sky. "Cross mentioned that he was checking on property investments in the area. That suggests he's not finished with his acquisition campaign. Whether the first sell or not, there will likely be more pressure on other ranchers in the region. Which means the danger might not be limited to this ranch." Exactly. Cross appears to have a systematic plan for gaining control of grazing land in this part of the territory. Any resistance to that plan puts someone at risk. As they prepared to retire for the evening, Sarah realized that her trial week had taken on dimensions she hadn't anticipated. What had begun as a simple assessment of whether she could be happy in an unconventional marriage had become a complex evaluation of her courage, her principles, and her willingness to face danger for the sake of security and partnership. Revelation about Cross and his methods had changed the stakes considerably. Sarah was no longer simply choosing between marriage to Daniel and continuing her search for employment elsewhere. She was choosing between safety and courage, between the known difficulties of life as a single woman with limited resources and the unknown dangers of standing with Daniel against men who apparently stopped at nothing to get what they wanted. As she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the Wyoming night, Sarah found herself thinking not just about her own welfare, but about Daniel's situation and that of his employees. If Cross was as ruthless as Daniel believed, then good people were going to suffer regardless of her personal decision. The question was whether she had the courage to be part of the resistance to such bullying, even knowing the risks involved. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Sarah found herself considering not just what she had to gain from marriage to Daniel Hayes, but what she might be able to contribute to his fight for what was right and just. The prospect was both terrifying and oddly inspiring. After months of feeling powerless and at the mercy of circumstances beyond her control, the possibility of taking a stand for something meaningful held unexpected appeal. But courage, Sarah reminded herself, was only valuable if it was tempered with wisdom. The question remained whether marrying Daniel represented wisdom or foolhardiness, and she would need the remaining days of her trial visit to determine the answer. Sarah woke before dawn on her 5th day at the ranch to the sound of shouting from the direction of the barn. She dressed quickly and rushed to her window, where she could see Daniel and his ranch hands gathered around something on the ground. Even from a distance, she could tell that whatever they had discovered was serious. When she reached the barn, she found the men standing over the body of one of Daniel's prize bulls. The massive animal lay motionless, foam dried around its mouth, its eyes glassy and staring. "Poison," Jack Morrison said grimly, kneeling beside the carcass. Same symptoms Jim Morrison's bull had before it died. Daniel's face was stone cold, with controlled fury. How did someone get close enough to poison him without the other cattle raising an alarm? Had to be someone who knew cattle, Miguel observed, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grim concern. Someone who could move among them without spooking the herd. Sarah felt her stomach lurch as the implications became clear. Cross hadn't wasted any time escalating his campaign of intimidation following Daniel's refusal to sell. The poisoning was both a financial blow and a clear message that Cross could strike at the ranch whenever he chose. "What's the value of the animal?" Sarah asked quietly. $300, maybe more," Daniel replied, his voice tight with anger. "But the real message isn't about the money. It's about vulnerability." Tom Bradley, the youngest of the ranch hands, was pale with shock. "Mr. Hayes, maybe you should consider that offer. If they can kill the bull without us seeing anything, what else might they do?" "That's exactly what Cross wants us to think," Daniel replied sharply. Then, seeing the fear in the young man's eyes, he softened his tone. "Tom, I won't hold it against any of you if you decide this job isn't worth the risk. You're all free to leave with full pay and good references." None of the three men moved. Jack Morrison straightened to his full height, his weathered face set in determined lines. "Mr. Hayes, my family's been in this territory for 20 years. We don't run from bullies." Miguel nodded agreement. "My father fought men like Cross in New Mexico. He taught me that sometimes you have to stand your ground." Even young Tom, despite his obvious fear, shook his head. "I'm staying, Mr. Hayes. This ranch gave me a chance when nobody else would." Sarah felt a surge of pride in these men and their loyalty to Daniel. But she also recognized the gravity of what they were all facing. Cross had demonstrated that he could strike at the ranch's most valuable assets without detection. The next escalation might target the people rather than the livestock. "We need to report this to the sheriff," Sarah suggested. Daniel's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff Hartwell is in Cross's pocket, either through bribery or intimidation. Filing a report would only confirm that we know Cross is behind this, and it wouldn't result in any meaningful investigation." As they disposed of the bull's carcass and took precautions to protect the remaining livestock, Sarah found herself studying Daniel with new eyes. The easygoing rancher she had come to know over the past few days had been replaced by someone harder, more alert, constantly scanning for potential threats. This was probably closer to the man who had served as a cavalry officer, she realized. Someone accustomed to danger and prepared to meet it head-on. That afternoon, while Daniel and his men worked to install additional security measures around the ranch, Sarah made a decision. She drove the wagon to Cedar Falls, ostensibly to purchase supplies, but actually to gather information about Nathaniel Cross and his business dealings. Her first stop was Murphy's boarding house, where Mrs. Murphy proved to be a valuable source of local gossip and rumor. "Cross has been buying up property all through the territory," the older woman confirmed over coffee in her kitchen. "Always pays well above market value, but there's something not right about the whole business. Folks who sell to him seem to disappear afterward, and the properties just sit empty. What do you think his real purpose is?" Mrs. Murphy glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned closer. "There's talk that he's working for the railroad interests back east. They want to control all the grazing land along the proposed new rail lines, and they're not particular about how they get it." This information added another layer to Sarah's understanding of the situation. If Cross was representing powerful Eastern interests with unlimited resources, Daniel's resistance was even more dangerous than she had realized. Her next stop was the general store, where she learned that Cross had recently purchased the building that housed both the store and the town's small bank. The storekeeper, Mr. Peterson, was clearly nervous about discussing his new landlord. "He raised the rent considerably," Peterson admitted reluctantly. "Said it was necessary to bring the property up to Eastern standards." Several other business owners received similar notices. "What happens if you can't pay the increased rent?" Peterson's face was pale with worry. "He's offered to buy out the businesses of anyone who can't meet the new terms." "Very generous offers, actually, but then where would we go? The store is all I know." By the time Sarah returned to the ranch, she had formed a clearer picture of Cross's strategy. He wasn't just targeting individual ranchers, but was systematically gaining control of the entire local economy. The railroad connection suggested he had backing from sources with deep pockets and political influence. Daniel was waiting for her when she drove into the yard, his expression grim. "Where did you go?" "I was worried when I found you weren't in the house." Sarah told him what she had learned in town, watching his face grow increasingly troubled as she related the details of Cross's apparent larger strategy. "It's worse than I thought," Daniel said finally. "If he controls the town businesses as well as the ranches, he'll have complete economic dominance over the entire area." "Daniel, maybe Tom was right. Maybe you should consider selling while Cross is still making generous offers." Daniel's eyes flashed with anger, but it wasn't directed at her. "Sarah, if I sell out, what happens to Jack and Miguel and Tom? What happens to Peterson and the other business owners in town? Cross will have won, and good people will suffer for it. But what happens to you if you don't sell? What happens to me if I stay here and marry you?" The question hung between them, stark and unavoidable. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly older than his years. "I don't know," he admitted. "I honestly don't know how far Cross is prepared to go, or what resources he has access to. But I know that if men like him aren't opposed, they'll keep talking and talking until there's nothing left for honest folks." That evening, as they sat on the porch in the gathering darkness, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. "Daniel, I want to stay." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Even knowing the risks?" "Especially knowing the risks." Sarah's voice was steady despite the fear that churned in her stomach. "I've spent the last few months feeling helpless, at the mercy of circumstances beyond my control. For the first time since leaving Ohio, I have the opportunity to take a stand for something that matters. Sarah, this isn't your fight. You don't owe me or anyone else in this territory anything. You're wrong. This is my fight now." She stood and moved to the porch railing, looking out at the ranch that had begun to feel like home. "Cross and men like him prey on people like me, people who are alone and vulnerable. If I run now, I'll spend the rest of my life running from one threat or another." Daniel joined her at the railing, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body in the cool night air. "Marriage to me won't make you safer, Sarah. It might actually put you in more danger. But it will mean I'm not facing that danger alone." She turned to face him directly. "Daniel, I'm not staying just because I need security. I'm staying because I believe in what you're fighting for, and because I think we might be stronger together than either of us could be alone." The words surprised them both with their intensity. What had begun as a practical arrangement had evolved into something deeper, a partnership based on shared values and mutual respect. "Are you sure?" Daniel asked. "Once we're married, there's no going back. Cross will see you as part of whatever threat he believes I represent." "I'm sure, but I have one condition." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I want to be a full partner in whatever we're facing. No protecting me from information because you think it's too dangerous for me to know. No making decisions about our safety without consulting me." Sarah's voice was firm. "If we're going to face this together, it has to be as equals." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Agreed, though I reserve the right to worry about you. And I reserve the right to worry about you." They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Cedar Falls with Mrs. Patterson and the ranch hands as witnesses. Sheriff Hartwell performed the ceremony with obvious reluctance, his nervousness suggesting that he was aware of the broader implications of the union. As they exchanged vows, Sarah realized that she was not just marrying Daniel Hayes, but was formally joining the resistance to Cross's campaign of intimidation. The ring on her finger was as much a symbol of defiance as it was a symbol of marriage. The reception was held at the ranch, with Mrs. Patterson providing a wedding cake and the ranch hands contributing music and heartfelt toasts. Despite the circumstances that had brought them together, Sarah found herself genuinely happy as she danced with her new husband under the Wyoming stars. But even as they celebrated, everyone present was aware that they were now all targets in Cross's larger campaign. The wedding had been as much a declaration of war as a declaration of love, and the consequences of that declaration would soon become clear. That night, as Sarah settled into the master bedroom that was now officially hers, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just over a week. She had come to Wyoming territory as a desperate woman begging for work at every door. Now she was Mrs. Daniel Hayes, co-owner of a prosperous ranch and full partner in a fight for the future of their community. The transformation was both exhilarating and terrifying. But as she listened to Daniel's steady breathing beside her, Sarah knew she had made the right choice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Sarah woke on her 10th day as Mrs. Daniel Hayes to the sound of gunfire echoing across the valley. She bolted upright in bed, her heart racing as she registered that Daniel's side of the bed was already empty and cold. Through the bedroom window, she could see muzzle flashes in the darkness near the cattle pens, and the terrified lowing of frightened animals filled the air. She dressed quickly in the practical clothes she had learned to wear for ranch work, then grabbed the Winchester rifle Daniel had insisted she learn to use during their brief honeymoon period. The lessons had seemed like an overabundance of caution at the time, but now she was grateful for his insistence on her preparation. The main floor of the house was empty, but she could see lights in the bunkhouse and hear shouted commands from the direction of the barn. Moving to the kitchen window that offered the best view of the ranch yard, Sarah could make out several figures moving between the buildings with purposeful stealth that belonged to neither Daniel nor his ranch hands. Hand touched her shoulder and she spun around, rifle raised, before recognizing Jack Morrison in the dim light. "Easy, Mrs. Hayes," he whispered urgently. "It's just me. Mr. Hayes sent me to get you to safety. What's happening out there?" "Cross men, maybe 6 or 7 of them. They've set fire to the hay barn and they're trying to stampede the cattle." Jack's weathered face was grim in the lamplight. "Mr. Hayes and the others are trying to contain the damage, but we're outnumbered." Sarah moved toward the back door, but Jack caught her arm. "Ma'am, Mr. Hayes wants you to take the tunnel to the root cellar and stay hidden until this is over." "What tunnel?" Jack led her to a section of the kitchen floor where a concealed trapdoor opened to reveal a narrow passage. Mr. Hayes had it built as a precaution after the bull was poisoned. "It leads to the old root cellar about 50 yards from the house." Sarah stared at the dark opening, understanding that Daniel had been preparing for exactly this kind of attack. The realization that he had anticipated the need for her to hide while he and his men fought for their lives filled her with both admiration for his foresight and fury at the circumstances that made such preparations necessary. "I'm not hiding while my husband fights for our ranch," she said firmly. "Mrs. Hayes, you don't understand the danger." "I understand it perfectly." Sarah checked the rifle to ensure it was properly loaded. "Jack, where would I be most useful?" The ranch hand studied her for a moment, seeming to weigh his loyalty to Daniel's instructions against the determination he saw in her eyes. "The house offers the best defensive position," he said finally. "You could cover the main approach and watch for anyone trying to circle around behind Mr. Hayes and the others." "Then that's where I'll be." As Jack slipped back outside to rejoin the fight, Sarah positioned herself at a window that commanded a view of the ranch yard. The hay barn was indeed burning, its flames casting dancing shadows across the entire area and making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe among the moving figures. She could see Daniel near the cattle pens, working with Miguel to prevent the herd from breaking through the fence in their panic. Tom was attempting to control the horses in the main corral, while other figures she didn't recognize were moving with clear hostile intent toward the ranch hands. Sarah had never shot at another human being, but her father had taught her to hunt, and her recent lessons with Daniel had refreshed skills she thought she had forgotten. When she saw one of the intruders raising a rifle toward Daniel's back, instinct took over. Her shot rang out across the yard, and the man stumbled and fell. She had aimed for his shoulder, not wanting to kill if it could be avoided, but the distance and poor light made precision difficult. The important thing was that Daniel was no longer in immediate danger from that particular threat. The sound of her rifle drew attention to the house, and Sarah saw 2 men break away from the main conflict to advance toward her position. She fired again, this time aiming at the ground near their feet, hoping to discourage rather than kill. The men took cover behind a water trough, but their advance had been halted. For nearly an hour, the battle raged across the ranch yard. Sarah lost count of the shots she fired, focusing only on providing cover for Daniel and his men when she could identify clear threats. The Winchester's familiar weight in her hands became a comfort as she settled into the rhythm of combat. Gradually, the sounds of conflict began to die down. The hay barn continued to burn, but the immediate threat of the cattle stampeding had been contained. Sarah could see Daniel and his men regrouping near the main corral, their movements suggesting they had gained control of the situation. When Daniel finally entered the house, his face was blackened with smoke and his shirt torn from the night's exertions. He found Sarah still at her post by the window, the rifle ready across her knees. "Are you hurt?" were his first words as he crossed quickly to her side. "I'm fine. What about you and the others?" Jack took a graze on his arm, but nothing serious. "Miguel and Tom are shaken, but unhurt." Daniel's hands moved over her face and arms, checking for injuries despite her assurances. "Sarah, you were supposed to be in the tunnel. I was more useful." "Here, did we drive them off?" Daniel nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "For now, but this was just the beginning. The cross is escalating faster than I expected." As dawn broke over the ranch, the full extent of the damage became clear. The hay barn was a total loss, representing both a significant financial blow and the loss of winter feed for the cattle. Several fences had been damaged in the attempt to stampede the herd, and there were bullet holes in various buildings throughout the compound. But they had survived, and more importantly, they had proven they could defend themselves against organized attack. Sarah felt a fierce pride in what they had accomplished, tempered by the knowledge that Cross would not be deterred by a single failed raid. "We need help," Daniel said as they surveyed the damage over breakfast. "Cross has more resources than we can match with just the 5 of us." "What kind of help?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "I need to contact some of my old army friends, men I served with who understand this kind of conflict. And we need to reach out to other ranchers in the territory who are facing similar pressure from Cross." Over the following days, Daniel sent carefully worded telegrams to former cavalry officers scattered across the western territories. The responses that came back were encouraging. Several men expressed willingness to come to Wyoming if the situation warranted armed intervention. Meanwhile, Sarah took on the task of reaching out to the wives and families of other ranchers in the area. She discovered that many of them had experienced similar incidents to what had happened at the Double H mysterious accidents: dead livestock, fires of suspicious origin, and increasing pressure to sell their properties to Cross or his representatives. "Mrs. Patterson was right when she said this was bigger than just our ranch," Sarah reported to Daniel after a day spent visiting neighboring homesteads. "The Hendricks lost 2 horses to poisoning last month. The Weatherbys had their well contaminated. The Sullivans' youngest son was badly beaten by strangers when he was in town for supplies." Daniel's expression darkened as he listened to the catalog of incidents. "Cross is waging war against everyone who won't sell to him. The question is whether we can organize enough resistance to make him reconsider his strategy." The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days after Sarah's visits to the neighboring ranches, wagons began arriving at the Double H carrying families who had decided they could no longer remain isolated on their own properties. The Hendricks came first, followed by the Weatherbys. Then the Sullivans and 2 other families Sarah didn't know. "We figured there was safety in numbers," Bob Hendricks explained as his family unloaded their possessions. "Cross can pick us off one at a time, but he'll have a harder time going after all of us together." Within a week, the Double H Ranch had become an armed camp. The main house accommodated the women and children, while the men constructed additional shelters and defensive positions around the property. Daniel's military experience proved invaluable in organizing the defense and establishing patrol schedules. Sarah found herself taking on responsibilities she had never imagined when she first accepted Daniel's proposal. She coordinated the feeding and housing of more than 20 people, organized the women into teams for cooking, cleaning, and child care, and helped establish communication protocols with the outside world. "You've become quite the general," Mrs. Patterson observed one evening as Sarah coordinated the next day's assignments. "Daniel chose well when he asked you to be his partner." "I never expected to be organizing a military campaign," Sarah admitted. "A month ago I was begging for work as a housekeeper." "Life has a way of calling forth qualities we didn't know we possessed," the older woman replied. "You were meant for more than keeping house, my dear." The defensive preparations proved their worth when Cross's next attack came. This time he brought more than a dozen men, apparently expecting to overwhelm the ranch through superior numbers. Instead, they found themselves facing coordinated resistance from prepared defenders who knew the terrain and had clear lines of communication. The battle was fierce, but brief. Cross's men had expected to face a few isolated ranchers, not a well-organized defensive force with military leadership and tactical advantages. After losing several men to the defenders' accurate fire, they retreated in confusion. But Sarah recognized that their victory, while satisfying, was likely to escalate the conflict. Further, Cross had been embarrassed by his failure to overwhelm what he had expected to be easy targets. His next response would likely be even more severe. Her concerns proved justified when Daniel received a telegram from one of his army contacts in Cheyenne. Cross had apparently petitioned the territorial government for assistance in dealing with what he characterized as an armed insurrection by lawless ranchers. There was a possibility that federal troops might be deployed to restore order, which would put the defenders in an impossible position. "We need to end this before it reaches that point," Daniel told the assembled ranchers during an evening meeting. "If Cross brings the army into this, we'll be branded as outlaws regardless of the justice of our cause. What do you propose?" Bob Hendricks asked. Daniel's expression was grim but determined. "We go after Cross directly. Cut the head off the snake before it can call for help." The plan that emerged from their discussions was both audacious and dangerous. A small group would infiltrate Cheyenne and confront Cross in his office, armed with evidence of his illegal activities and backed by the threat of exposing his methods to territorial and federal authorities. Sarah insisted on being part of the infiltration team, despite Daniel's strong objections. "I can move through town without attracting the attention that you and the other men would," she argued. "Cross doesn't know me well enough to recognize me if I'm dressed as a respectable town woman running errands. Sarah, if something goes wrong, you could be killed or worse. If we don't stop Cross now, I could be killed anyway when he brings the army against us," she replied. "At least this way we're taking action instead of just reacting to his moves." Reluctantly, Daniel agreed to include her in the team, though he insisted on extensive planning and backup arrangements. Sarah would pose as the wife of a prospective land buyer seeking information about Cross's acquisitions. Once she had confirmed his location and routine, the men would move in for the confrontation. As they prepared for what might be the decisive engagement in their conflict with Cross, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. She had come to Wyoming territory seeking nothing more than honest work and basic security. Instead, she had found herself at the center of a battle for the future of an entire region, married to a man she had learned to love through shared danger and common purpose. The woman who had once begged for work at every door had become a strategic planner and combatant in a war she had never sought but now embraced as her own. Whether they would survive the coming confrontation remained to be seen, but Sarah knew that regardless of the outcome, she had found her true calling in standing with Daniel and their allies against those who would prey upon the innocent. Defenseless. The counterattack was set to begin at dawn. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days, with Sarah traveling separately from Daniel and his men to avoid drawing attention. She rode in a hired buggy, dressed in the finest clothes she possessed, playing the role of a prosperous rancher's wife interested in Cross's land acquisition services. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the territorial capital came into view, but her outward demeanor remained calm and confident. Cheyenne was larger and more sophisticated than Cedar Falls, with brick buildings, paved streets, and the bustle of serious commerce. Sarah had arranged to stay at the Grand Union Hotel, the same establishment where Cross maintained his business offices on the second floor. The proximity would allow her to observe his routines while maintaining her cover as a potential client. The hotel lobby was elegant by frontier standards, with polished wood fixtures and imported carpeting that spoke of Eastern money and influence. Sarah registered under the name Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, the identity she and Daniel had carefully constructed for this mission. According to their cover story, she was the wife of a successful cattle rancher from Colorado, looking to expand their operations into Wyoming territory. I understand Mr. Cross handles many of the finest properties in this area, Sarah told the hotel clerk with practiced casualness. I'm hoping to schedule a meeting with him during my stay. Indeed, ma'am. Mr. Cross is well regarded in business circles. His office is just upstairs if you'd like to inquire about an appointment. Sarah thanked the clerk and made her way to her room, noting the location of Cross's office and the general layout of the building. From her window, she had a clear view of the street and could observe who came and went from the hotel entrance. More importantly, she could signal Daniel and his men when the time came for their confrontation. That afternoon, Sarah presented herself at Cross's office, where a nervous-looking clerk informed her that Mr. Cross was very busy but might be able to see her briefly if she could wait. The waiting area allowed her to observe the flow of visitors and overhear fragments of conversation that confirmed their suspicions about Cross's methods. The Railroad Commission approved the new shipping rates, she heard one man tell another. As they waited, 20% increase on all cattle shipments from the Northwestern Territories. Cross's influence with the commissioners is remarkable, the second man replied. He certainly knows how to encourage cooperation. When Sarah was finally admitted to Cross's private office, she found him exactly as she remembered from his visit to the ranch, well-dressed and confident with cold eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His office was expensively furnished, with maps of the territory covering one entire wall and a large safe prominently positioned behind his desk. Mrs. Morrison, Cross said, rising to greet her with practiced charm. I understand you're interested in acquiring ranch property in our beautiful territory. That's correct. My husband and I have been very successful with our Colorado operations, and we're looking to expand. Sarah settled into the chair Cross indicated, noting the locations of doors and windows while maintaining her role. I understand you handle many of the finest properties available. Indeed, I do. I've been instrumental in helping Eastern investors acquire some of the most promising ranches in the region. Cross moved to the map wall, pointing out various properties. Many of these operations were struggling under local management, but they've become much more profitable under proper business principles. What happened to the original owners? Oh, they were compensated generously for their properties. Most chose to relocate to areas better suited to their, shall we say, more limited vision of agricultural development. Cross's smile didn't waver, but Sarah detected satisfaction in his tone that made her skin crawl. They spent an hour discussing fictitious requirements for the Morrison Ranch expansion, with Cross showing increasing interest as Sarah described their supposed financial resources. He was clearly calculating how much he might extract from these new potential victims. I'd be very interested in showing you some of our premium properties, Cross said finally. In fact, I have a beautiful ranch about 50 miles northwest of here that might be perfect for your needs. The Double H Ranch, owned by a man named Hayes who's proven quite resistant to reasonable business offers. Sarah's blood ran cold, but she maintained her composed expression. Resistant in what way? Oh, you know how these local ranchers can be. Sentimental about land they think they own, reluctant to accept the realities of modern business development. Cross leaned back in his chair, his confidence apparent. "But I expect Mr. Hayes will become more reasonable very soon. He's been experiencing some operational difficulties that tend to clarify a man's priorities." "What sort of difficulties?" "Cross's smile became predatory. "The kind that happens when men refuse to recognize superior authority. Accidents with livestock, problems with shipping arrangements, isolated ranch properties can be quite vulnerable to various misfortunes." The casual way he discussed what amounted to terrorism against Daniel and others like him filled Sarah with cold fury, but she forced herself to nod knowingly, as if she understood and approved of such business methods. "I see. And you expect Mr. Hayes to become more amenable to selling soon?" "Very soon, I believe. In fact, I have reason to think his situation may resolve itself within the next few days." Cross consulted his pocket watch. These stubborn types usually come around once they realize the futility of opposing progress. Sarah concluded the meeting by expressing interest in viewing the Hayes property once it became available, then returned to her hotel room to prepare the signal for Daniel and his team. That evening, she positioned a lamp in her window according to their pre-arranged code, indicating that Cross was in his office and that the confrontation should proceed. Daniel, Jack, and Miguel had entered town separately and were staying at a different hotel under assumed names. When they saw Sarah's signal, they made their way to the Grand Union through back alleys, avoiding the main streets where they might be recognized. The plan was straightforward but dangerous. They would confront Cross in his office after business hours when the building was largely empty. Sarah would create a diversion in the lobby while the men accessed Cross's office from the rear stairwell. Once they had secured Cross and any associates who might be present, they would present him with an ultimatum backed by evidence they had gathered about his illegal activities. At exactly 9 o'clock, Sarah made her way to the hotel lobby, where she engaged the night clerk in conversation about local entertainment options. Her animated discussion about theater performances and social events drew his attention while Daniel's team slipped past toward the rear stairs. The confrontation in Cross's office was brief but decisive. Cross had been working late, reviewing what appeared to be financial records related to his various property acquisitions. When Daniel, Jack, and Miguel entered through the rear door, he looked up with surprise that quickly turned to recognition and alarm. "Daniel Hayes," Cross said, his hand moving toward a desk drawer. "This is unexpected." "Keep your hands where we can see them," Daniel commanded, his revolver drawn and trained on Cross. Miguel moved to secure the office door while Jack positioned himself by the window to watch for anyone approaching the building. "What do you want?" Cross demanded, though his usual arrogance was tempered by the recognition that he was now at a severe disadvantage. "We want you to end your campaign against the ranchers in our territory," Daniel replied. "The intimidation, the sabotage, the violence, all of it stops now." Cross laughed, though the sound was forced. "You can't be serious. You're threatening a legitimate businessman in his own office. The authorities will be very interested." "In these," Jack interrupted, indicating the papers scattered across Cross's desk, "especially the ones detailing payments to certain officials, and the schedules for various accidents that have befallen uncooperative ranchers." Cross's face paled as he realized they had been examining his private records. The documents on his desk included correspondence with railroad officials, payment schedules for hired intimidators, and detailed plans for pressuring specific property owners. "You have no right to examine private business papers," Cross blustered, but his confidence was clearly shaken. "We have every right to defend ourselves against a man who's been waging war against honest ranchers," Daniel replied. "The question now is whether you're going to end this quietly or whether we need to involve the territorial authorities." "The territorial authorities work for me," Cross said, though his tone suggested he was less certain of this than he wanted to appear. Maybe the local ones do, Jack said with a grim smile. But I doubt your influence extends to the federal marshals. Who'd be interested in your railroad fraud schemes? At that moment, Sarah appeared in the doorway, having left the clerk downstairs to join the confrontation. She carried a leather satchel that contained additional evidence they had gathered about Cross's operations. "Mrs. Morrison," Cross said with bitter realization. "Or should I say Mrs. Hayes?" "You should say nothing at all," Sarah replied coolly, "unless you're ready to discuss the terms of your withdrawal from our territory." What followed was a tense negotiation that lasted nearly 2 hours. Cross initially tried to bluff, claiming he had backup arriving and that harming him would bring severe consequences. But as Daniel's team presented more evidence of his illegal activities, including testimony from ranchers who had been victimized and documents proving his corruption of local officials, his position became increasingly untenable. The turning point came when Sarah produced a letter they had intercepted, written by Cross to his eastern backers, detailing his methods for acquiring properties through intimidation and violence. The letter was damning evidence that could result in federal charges and imprisonment. "What do you want?" Cross asked finally, his arrogance replaced by the desperate calculation of a man who saw his empire crumbling. "Complete withdrawal from Wyoming territory," Daniel stated. "All current acquisition efforts end immediately. All properties obtained through illegal means are returned to their original owners at fair market value. All hired intimidators are dismissed and ordered to leave the territory. And in return? In return, this evidence doesn't find its way to federal authorities, and you get to walk away from this territory with whatever legal business interests you can salvage." Cross considered the terms for several minutes, his face cycling through anger, fear, and resignation. Finally, he nodded curtly. "I'll need a week to arrange the transfers and withdrawals." "You have 3 days," Sarah said firmly, "and we'll be monitoring your activities to ensure compliance." "How do I know you won't turn over that evidence anyway once I've met your demands?" Daniel and Sarah exchanged glances, communicating without words in the way that married couples learn to do. "Because unlike you," Daniel said, "we keep our word when we give it." The return journey to Cedar Falls was tense, with everyone expecting Cross to attempt some form of retaliation before completing his withdrawal. But the 3 days passed without incident, and telegrams from contacts in various towns confirmed that Cross's operatives were indeed leaving the territory. The transformation of the Double H Ranch from armed camp back to working cattle operation took several weeks. The families who had taken refuge there were able to return to their own properties, though many maintained the mutual defense agreements that had proven so effective against Cross's threat. Sarah found herself settling into married life under circumstances she could never have imagined when she first accepted Daniel's proposal. Their relationship, which had begun as a practical arrangement, had evolved through shared danger into something deeper and more meaningful than either had expected. "Do you ever regret accepting my unconventional proposal?" Daniel asked one evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Sarah considered the question seriously, thinking about all that had happened since that first conversation outside Murphy's boarding house. "Never," she said finally. "I came to Wyoming territory looking for work, any kind of honest work that would keep me from destitution. Instead, I found a partnership that's made me stronger than I ever thought I could be, even though it nearly got you killed several times. Especially because of that. The woman who was begging for work at every door was afraid of everything: poverty, rejection, being alone. The woman I've become isn't afraid of those things anymore." Daniel reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become natural and comforting. "What are you afraid of now?" Sarah smiled, looking out at the ranch they had defended together, the land they were building into something lasting and meaningful. "Nothing," she said, and realized she meant it. I'm not afraid of anything anymore." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of their home, preparing dinner for a gathering of neighboring ranchers and their families. The kitchen that had once seemed so disorganized and underutilized now hummed with efficient activity, filled with the aromas of fresh bread and roasting beef. The parlor had been expanded to accommodate larger gatherings, and the walls were lined with photographs of their friends and chosen family. The ranch house had become a center of community activity, hosting everything from barn raisings to wedding celebrations. Daniel entered the kitchen, his face bright with excitement about something. "Sarah, come outside. There's something you need to see." She followed him to the front porch, where a familiar wagon was approaching the house. As it drew closer, Sarah recognized Mrs. Murphy from Cedar Falls, but there was someone else with her, a young woman Sarah didn't immediately recognize. "Mrs. Hayes," Mrs. Murphy called as she climbed down from the wagon. "I'd like you to meet Miss Catherine Bennett. She just arrived from Kansas, looking for honest work." Sarah studied the young woman, noting the careful mending of her dress, the determined set of her shoulders despite obvious exhaustion, and the hope mixed with desperation in her eyes. She looked exactly as Sarah had looked that first day she'd knocked on doors in Cedar Falls. "Miss Bennett," Sarah said, stepping down from the porch to greet her properly. "I'm Sarah Hayes. Welcome to Wyoming territory." "Ma'am, I hate to impose, but Mrs. Murphy suggested you might know of employment opportunities in the area. I can cook, clean, sew, tend children, anything honest." Sarah smiled, remembering her own desperate recitation of skills to anyone who would listen. "As it happens, Miss Bennett, we've been discussing the need for a teacher for the children in this area. The ranchers have been talking about establishing a school, and we need someone qualified to run it." The young woman's face lit up with hope. "I taught school in Kansas before circumstances forced me to leave. I have references and—" "I'm sure you're perfectly qualified," Sarah interrupted gently. "But first, you look exhausted and hungry. Come inside, have some dinner, and we'll discuss the details afterward." As she led Catherine Bennett into the house that had become the center of a thriving community, Sarah reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from desperation to fulfillment. She had come to Wyoming territory as a woman with nothing, begging for work at every door. Now she was Mrs. Daniel Hayes, co-owner of a successful ranch, a leader in their community, and someone who could offer hope to other women facing the same desperate circumstances she had once known. The transformation was complete, but more importantly, it was lasting. The job Daniel had offered her, being his wife, had turned out to be more than either of them had imagined. It had become a calling, a purpose, and the foundation for a life neither of them could have built alone. As Catherine Bennett settled into the parlor with a plate of food and a cup of coffee, surrounded by the warmth and welcome of the Hayes household, Sarah knew that the cycle was beginning again. Another desperate woman would find hope, another life would be transformed, and the community they had fought to protect would grow stronger. The woman who had once begged for work at every door was now in a position to open doors for others, and that knowledge filled her with a satisfaction deeper than she had ever imagined possible. Over dinner, Catherine Bennett shared her story with the gathered families. Her father had been a schoolmaster in Kansas who died suddenly of pneumonia, leaving Catherine and her younger brother with debts that consumed their small inheritance. When the creditors took their home and possessions, Catherine had been forced to find work to support both herself and her 15-year-old brother Timothy. "I tried the same things you probably did," Catherine said to Sarah as they cleared the dinner dishes together. "Approached every household in town offering to teach their children, clean their homes, anything that might provide income. But Kansas has been hit hard by the drought, and most families are struggling just to feed themselves." Sarah listened with the deep understanding of someone who had walked the same desperate path. "What happened to your brother?" "He's working at a grain elevator back in Topeka. The pay is barely enough for his room and board, but it's something." I came west hoping to find better opportunities so I could send for him once I'm established. The familiar weight of family responsibility, the careful calculations of survival, the bone-deep exhaustion of constantly searching for security. Sarah remembered all of it with crystalline clarity. But now she also understood how dramatically circumstances could change with the right opportunity and the courage to seize it. "Daniel," she said that evening as they prepared for bed, "what would you think about expanding the school idea? Not just for the local children, but as a boarding school for children from throughout the territory." Daniel looked up from the ranch ledgers he'd been reviewing. "That's ambitious. What made you think of it?" "Catherine's story reminded me that there are probably many families scattered across isolated ranches who can't provide proper education for their children. If we could establish a real school here, with boarding facilities, we could serve a much wider area. It would require significant investment. Buildings, teachers, supplies, ongoing operational costs." Sarah moved to the window that looked out over the ranch yard, where the bunkhouse and other buildings were silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "We have the land, we have community support, and we've proven we can organize people to work toward common goals. You're thinking about more than just education. I'm thinking about creating something lasting that serves people who need it most. Children from remote ranches, young women like Catherine, and like I was, families who are struggling to build lives in difficult circumstances." Sarah turned from the window to face her husband. "We could make the Double H Ranch a center for opportunity instead of just a cattle operation." Daniel set aside his ledgers and joined her at the window. "You know, when I first came to Wyoming Territory, I thought success would be measured by the size of my herd and the price of beef at market. But what we've built here, the community we've created, seems more valuable than any amount of cattle." "Then you'll consider the school expansion?" "I'll do more than consider it. I'll help you plan it." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into developing plans for what they began calling the Hayes Territory Academy. She corresponded with educators in Denver and Cheyenne to understand best practices for frontier education. She visited other ranches to assess demand for boarding school services and to gauge support from potential families. The response was overwhelming. Ranch families throughout the territory expressed eagerness to send their children to a quality school, even if it meant separation during the academic year. Many offered to contribute labor, materials, or ongoing financial support to make the academy a reality. Mrs. Patterson proved to be an invaluable ally in the planning process. Her late husband had served on the Territorial Education Board, and she understood the regulatory requirements for establishing a formal school. "You'll need to register with the territorial government and meet certain standards for facilities and curriculum," she explained during one of their planning meetings. "But I know people in Cheyenne who can help navigate the bureaucracy." Catherine Bennett became Sarah's co-conspirator in developing the educational program. Her teaching experience and understanding of children's needs complemented Sarah's organizational skills and vision for the school's broader mission. "We could offer more than just basic academics," Catherine suggested. "Practical skills like bookkeeping and basic law for the boys who'll be running ranches someday. Domestic arts and business skills for the girls who'll be managing households. And possibly businesses of their own." "What about higher education preparation? There must be some students who would benefit from college preparation." "Definitely. We could establish partnerships with universities in Denver or even back east for qualified students." As autumn approached, construction began on the first dedicated school building. Daniel coordinated the building project with the same efficiency he brought to ranch operations, while Sarah managed the countless details required to transform their vision into reality. The building that emerged from their planning was substantial and well-designed. The main floor housed classrooms, a library, and administrative offices. The second floor provided dormitory space for boarding students, with separate wings for boys and girls. A separate building housed a dining hall and additional recreational space. But the true test of their vision came with the arrival of their first students in September. 15 children, ranging in age from 8 to 16, arrived from ranches throughout the territory. Some came eagerly, excited about the educational opportunities. Others arrived reluctantly, homesick and uncertain about life away from their families. Sarah found herself serving not just as administrator, but as surrogate mother, counselor, and advocate for students who were struggling with the transition to boarding school life. Her own experience of leaving home under difficult circumstances gave her unique insight into the challenges these children faced. Young Timothy Morrison, son of Jack Morrison, arrived with a chip on his shoulder and a determination to prove that school was a waste of time for a future rancher. Sarah recognized the defensive bravado immediately, having employed similar tactics herself when facing uncertain situations. Instead of confronting his attitude directly, she assigned him to help with the ranch operations during his free time. Working alongside his father and the other ranch hands gave Timothy a sense of purpose and belonging, while gradually demonstrating the value of the mathematical and business skills he was learning in the classroom. Reading and writing won't help me manage cattle, he had declared during his first week. How will you negotiate contracts with buyers if you can't read the terms? Sarah countered. How will you track your expenses and profits if you can't manage accounts? How will you communicate with suppliers and customers if you can't write clear letters? By October, Timothy had become one of the school's most dedicated students, particularly excelling in mathematics and business studies. Mary Hendricks presented different challenges. The daughter of Bob Hendricks, one of the families who had taken refuge at the Double H during the conflict with Cross, she was intellectually gifted but socially withdrawn. Years of isolation on her family's remote ranch had left her uncomfortable with group activities and peer relationships. Sarah worked with Catherine to design individualized learning plans that challenged Mary academically while gradually building her confidence in social situations. They paired her with younger students who needed tutoring, giving her opportunities to demonstrate her knowledge while developing leadership skills. Mary has the potential to attend university, Catherine reported after the first term. Her mathematical abilities are extraordinary, and her writing skills are already at college level. What does she want to do with those abilities? She talks about becoming a teacher herself, or possibly studying law. She's fascinated by the legal aspects of land ownership and business operations. Sarah smiled, remembering her own hunger for knowledge and meaningful work. Then we need to make sure she has every opportunity to pursue those interests. The success of the Hayes Territory Academy's first year exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections. Students showed remarkable academic progress, and demand for enrollment the following year far exceeded their current capacity. But more importantly for Sarah, the school had become a catalyst for broader community development. Families who sent their children to the academy often chose to relocate closer to the school, bringing new businesses and economic activity to the region. The town of Cedar Falls began expanding to accommodate the growing population. New shops opened to serve the academy families. A small hotel was built to house visiting parents and prospective families. The railroad even extended a spur line to better serve the area's growing importance. By the school's second anniversary, Sarah found herself at the center of a thriving community that bore little resemblance to the struggling frontier settlement she had first encountered. But she also discovered that success brought new challenges and responsibilities. A delegation from the territorial capital arrived in the spring of the academy's third year with a proposal that would test Sarah's commitment to her original vision. The territorial government wanted to designate the Hayes Territory Academy as an official territorial school, providing significant funding in exchange for accepting government oversight and curriculum standards. It would mean financial security for the school, the delegation leader explained during meetings at the ranch. Guaranteed funding, official accreditation, recognition throughout the territory. What would it mean for our independence? Sarah asked, would we still be able to serve the students and families who most need our help? The territorial government is interested in educational excellence. Mrs. Hayes, I'm sure accommodations could be made for your particular mission. Sarah exchanged glances with Daniel, communicating the skepticism they both felt about such assurances. Their experience with government officials during the cross-conflict had taught them to be wary of promises made by people who might not remain in office to honor them. We need time to consider your proposal, Daniel said diplomatically. This is a significant decision that affects not just our family, but the entire community we've built here. After the delegation returned to Cheyenne, Sarah and Daniel spent long evenings discussing the implications of accepting territorial support. The financial benefits were undeniable, but they both worried about losing control over the schools. Mission and character, what do you think? Daniel asked as they walked through the school buildings one evening, observing the students engaged in their evening studies. I think we've proven that what we built here works because we kept control over our own decisions, Sarah replied. The moment we hand that control to distant bureaucrats who don't understand our community, we risk losing everything that makes this place special. Their decision to decline the territorial government's offer proved wise when, 6 months later, budget cuts eliminated funding for several territorial educational programs. The schools that had accepted government support found themselves struggling to maintain operations when promised funds failed to materialize. Meanwhile, the Hayes Territory Academy continued to thrive under private management, supported by tuition payments, community contributions, and the ongoing success of the H Ranch operations. As Sarah approached her 5th anniversary in Wyoming Territory, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate job seeker to respected community leader. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe, yet every aspect of her current life bore witness to the reality of change. Standing in the Academy's library one afternoon, watching students absorbed in their books and assignments, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of knowing she had found her true calling. The woman who had once begged for work at every door had created opportunities for hundreds of others to build better lives through education and community support. The job Daniel had offered her, being his wife, had evolved into something neither of them had imagined possible. It had become a partnership that transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. And as she watched the next generation of Wyoming Territory's leaders developing their skills and character in the school they had built together, Sarah knew that the best chapters of their story were still being written. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.